All right, welcome back, everybody, as day 2 of Cyburgh continues on. At this time, I want to thank Schneider Downs for sponsoring our next panel discussion. Troy Fine, Senior Manager of Schneider Downs Cybersecurity Risk Advisory Services, will also be a panelist on the panel, which is Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, CMMC, Navigating Through the Murky Waters of Certification. So please welcome our panel moderator, Matt Bukovic, Technical Director of Cyber Risk and Resilience at the CERT Division of Carnegie Mellon University Software Engineering Institute. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you, David. It's good to be here. So in this session, we will navigate those waters and hopefully make them less murky for everyone. So we have a great cross-section of folks in the panel. I'd like to introduce the panelists now, starting with Greg Crabb. Greg is a principal consultant for SideChannel, the founder of 10.8. He's also the former CISO of the US Postal Service. Welcome, Greg.
Thanks, Matt.
As mentioned, we're also joined by Troy Fine, who is a senior manager, risk advisory services for Schneider Downs. We're joined by Sam Merrell, who is the Director of Global Information Security Compliance for Kennametal, a member of the Defense Industrial Base, and also joined by Katie Stewart. Katie Stewart is a senior member of the technical staff here at Carnegie Mellon University's Software Engineering Institute, the CERT Division, where I work. And our remarks today will be reflective of our own opinions and not that of the Department of Defense. Just want to put that note out there before we get started. So welcome, everyone. I'm hoping in this session we can tell the audience sort of what to prepare for when they contemplate CMMC as a new way of working. But first, I want to start with just a brief history lesson, and I was hoping Katie could take this question, which is, Katie, can you explain why CMMC, why now?
Yeah, so fundamentally, CMMC is being stood up to protect against the loss of CUI, or controlled unclassified information. For those of you who either are currently doing business with the DoD or you have in the past, you're familiar with the DFARS clause, the 7012 clause that took effect, I think, back in 2016. And 7012 basically says, well, among other things, is that organizations have to self-attest that they meet the 110 security requirements in NIST 800-171. So this was put in place back in 2016, and we're still seeing, the loss of CUI and sensitive data at an increasing rate, right? We're losing our IP. We're losing our technical advantage, to our adversaries through cyber espionage. And so that's kind of the call to action for CMMC. And there's 3 components that really build upon 7012 and address some of the shortcomings or, challenges with the current DFARS rule. The first is the idea of self-attestation. As most of you know, CMMC will require an on-site assessment. So an assessor will visit and actually verify that you are implementing the 130 CMMC controls as well as the process maturity components of the model. And it should be noted that the 130 include the existing 110 in 800-171. The second component with CMMC that's different is there's no longer an allowance for POAMs, right? So currently organizations that maybe aren't fully meeting a 171 security requirement, they can put a POAM or a plan of action in place to close that gap. And there isn't a mechanism for checking, that actually is being closed in a timely manner. So CMMC kind of seeks to, close that loophole, so to speak, by the not allowing POAMs. And the third component, I think this gets lost sometimes in the discussion, is that, CMMC is a leveled model. And some of the feedback that we've heard, around the DFARS is that sometimes it's difficult to understand. It's a one-size-fits-all model. Small, mid-sized businesses maybe struggle with the requirements. And we really tried to chart a path through the progressive nature of CMMC so that organizations could mature their capabilities both on the technical side and on the process side. And you'll see that reflected in a lot of the documentation. We tried to write a lot of really clear examples to really, arm companies with, the ability to properly implement these security requirements. So I think those are probably the three big highlights of kind of what's new and why CMMC.
Thanks, Katie. So a couple of things maybe to highlight based on the input, the explanation that you've given us. So this is an evolution of requirements that exist for defense industrial partners, right? So this issue of our IP being stolen by adversaries is getting worse, not better, right? It's not going away. I think there's some confusion that CMMC is wholly new. Certainly the model is new and the certification is new, but the DFARS, as you point out, require organizations to currently meet the criteria of level 3 in the model. I think it's important to note. So thanks, Katie. I certainly, as one of the model architects, as you pointed out, this is a leveled progressive model, right? It differentiates based on specific outcomes and capabilities. So Sam, I want to ask you a question as a member of the Defense Industrial Base. And if you look for the stat, you'll hear there's about 300,000 Defense Industrial Base partners in the US. That ranges from everyone making satellites and advanced aircraft to meet people making fasteners and bootlaces, right? And Kennametal is a very important strategic defense metals organization. From your perspective, how do you see CMMC, given that your organization has a significant stake in the defense industrial base, how do you see CMMC shaping your strategy and policy?
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, it's interesting because I kind of am of two minds, right? So I certainly I get what the model intention is, and the idea of wrapping controls around the data and having the controls follow the data as it goes through the supply chain it makes a lot of sense. But then I also have to balance that with the myriad other requirements that we have. So we have current compliance regimes related to things like the ISO 27001 standards that we comply with. We have to worry about other regulations across the globe, for example, GDPR, and all these different requirements pull us in different directions. And so we're always in this position of prioritizing where we spend our next dollar. And so CMMC is definitely having an impact on how we do that prioritization. So we are looking at CMMC as kind of in the same vein as we looked at data privacy a few years ago, where we have to specifically focus on a new type of information, and then we have to build auditable controls around how we protect that information. That's a little bit different than a more holistic approach to risk management. So the extension or the extra effort that we have to apply to CUI is it has that kind of impact to drive our strategy towards recognizing CUI as a new data type and making sure that that's called out as we build policies, procedures, standards, et cetera. And that's probably where we're seeing the biggest impact, is making sure we're meeting the letter of what the model says, and where without that model and guidance, we probably would just be more universal.
Thanks, Sam. So it sounds like certainly you anticipate modifying your strategy to account for it, but it sounds like it's also complementary, right? At the end of the day, in my opinion, there's a finite number of cybersecurity practices, and the order in which you apply those and the way in which you measure those is sort of the most variable pieces of the situation.
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah, just an apology to the audience and panelists. That really was a train. So I'm on CMU's campus, and at the very edge, there's train tracks, and reminding us of our industrial heritage and the industrial defense base. That really was a train. And I think it's the only one in the morning, so I do apologize for that. Troy, I'd like to ask you a question. So how do you see among your clients CMMC driving specific investments? So Sam described how it's going to modify strategy and the goals of a security organization. Are you seeing that this is prioritizing or perhaps deprioritizing certain elements of an investment strategy in cyber?
Yeah, well, I just want to comment on the train. I think that was a warning to the DIB. Like, be aware of what's coming.
That was the horn
perfectly. I was laughing when it happened because that's exactly what went through my head. But yeah, to answer your question, I think it definitely is going to start, to piggyback off of Sam, it is definitely going to start prioritizing cybersecurity investments. I mean, as Katie alluded to kind of in the first question, this 171 has been a requirement of a lot of contractors and suppliers for a lot of years now, but a lot of them just POAM'd everything, for lack of a better phrase, right? I mean, you could literally say, we're going to do this in, 6 months, a year, and you could say you were compliant, right? And the other piece of that is there was no way for the DoD or the government to enforce these requirements necessarily, and have an assessor go out and say, why is this still a POAM for 2 or 3 years, right? So people kind of just started, for lack of a better term, ignoring kind of the requirements and just saying, it is what it is. No one's going to check on it. And then CMMC started rolling around. And now people are starting to get serious. And like I said, I think they are going to start prioritizing cybersecurity. Now, I think it does depend on the level. So if we're going to be level 1, that's only going to require 17 practices. And I only say 17. I mean, there's probably 50 to 60 assessment objectives associated with those 17 practices. So it is still a big lift, even for a small company. I don't want to say that level 1 is not a big lift, because it still could be a big lift with a lot of investment. But if you need level 3, that's going to be like, Sam, his company might need level 4, even level 5, but that's going to be 130 practices, right? So to go from not doing anything to 130 practices and controls with 700 assessment objectives could be a very significant lift, right? If you didn't have an MDM solution, if you didn't have a SIM solution, if you didn't have MFA in place everywhere, like, these are just some of the investments you're going to have to think about in order to meet these controls. And identity access provider, like, it can go on and on, right? But again, it is going to depend on the size of your organization and what level, and the type of data you're getting from the DoD. So I think it's a really good thing. I just think that a lot of companies weren't, they were ignoring it until they were forced to, and now they're being forced to.
Thanks, Troy. I certainly, an important concept, and this has been mentioned a few times, is that the model is designed to scale both in complexity and in scope based on the type of information you're given access to. So CUI, right, is the heart of this effort, protecting CUI. There's a differentiation within the category of CUI that then drives the differentiation in the level that you're required to apply or perform with. And it's interesting, I think you're right, that there's a baseline of technical architecture that we could map out at each of those levels, saying if you don't have these pieces parts, you likely can't fully conform. So thanks, Troy. I want to shift slightly in our conversation, discussion of one of the conceptual underpinnings of CMMC. And I'd like to ask Greg if he's willing to elaborate on his experiences with these sorts of models. I know, Greg, when you were with the Postal Service, you looked at capability maturity models as one of the core pillars or tenets of your information security program. I was wondering if you might, for the audience this morning, describe the role that you see for models like this in shaping a security program.
Excellent question, Matt. And these models are extremely important to provide the Department of Defense with the assurance that they need to know that organizations that they're entrusting to hold CUI are actually committing the resources to execute on the practices that really implement the policies that make the protection of this information real. And I had the good fortune over the last 6 years to spend a lot of focus with Carnegie Mellon in implementing a model that was developed about 10 years ago or so, called the resilience management model. It's CERT's resilience management model. And there's a set of practices that are adopted in the CMMC, the maturity practices, that really help to provide DoD those assurances that a company is committing the resources to truly make the practices of the model stick. And that was something that I had done at scale at the Postal Service, and it's a commitment the organizations need to make. Do you have the funding that's necessary in order to be able to make these practices? Do you have the people that are properly trained and executing on a set of established practices that actually perform the objectives of each of the requirements under CMMC? And I had done those at scale. It's not trivial to have an organization commit to that resource base. And, you know, I think that those maturity practices that are extremely important in CMMC will help provide DoD with what they really need in order to provide for the protection of really the nation's most critical information.
Thanks, Greg. And I know there's certain insights that you can yield using a model like this rather than simply a checklist. And I think it's one of the things that might get lost in the conversation is I think the win here is that a longer checklist could have been the result of this. Just add things to the checklist, but the goal was to make this predictive. And being predictive means taking different measures. I know, Katie, you may have some thoughts on this, being steeped in measurement, cybersecurity, and being one of the architects of the model. So Greg, I wanted to get Katie's thoughts maybe back to you about comparing and contrasting your experience at USPS and what you're seeing with CMMC.
Yeah, so what Greg said is spot on. And just to give some history behind, you know, the 5 processes that are in CMMC, these weren't just picked out of the air, right? We have a long history of working with organizations like USPS and critical infrastructure, across critical infrastructure, where we have the data that shows if organizations do the things that Greg talked about, you know, planning and resourcing, you know, writing down their practices, measuring their activities, they outperform their peers on the technical controls implementation 99% of the time, right? We have the data that backs that up. So when we went through and really picked the subset of process maturity activities to put into CMMC, they really were the high value activities that are going to make your technical practices stick, right? You're going to be able to repeat them in times of disruption and in times of stress. And, you know, you're going to be able to be an agile and adaptive organization as the threat environment changes. And, you know, that is a key component of CMMC, is this process maturity aspect. And it really is to help organizations institutionalize their technical cybersecurity capabilities.
So if I can, from my perspective, that process maturity area is important. I agree. However, it's also really expensive, right? So from an implementer's perspective, that's one of the big unknowns that we have. So as we go from the checklist mentality that Matt was talking about to a process maturity mentality, that's where I can't say, I know how much this is going to cost my organization. And so that's where I guess a lot of the uncertainty comes in. What does it do to my budget, right? So you know, when it comes to as I mentioned, the things that I need to do above and beyond CMMC for other security work that we need to do, what's the trade-off, and how much am I taking from that pile to invest into here? Because, you know, teaching process maturity and process discipline is a difficult thing to any organization, and getting, you know, steering the ship so that you can actually live that is not a cheap proposal. And so that's part of the mountain we're trying to climb now, is first laying the foundation of moving from, you know, executing security tasks on a daily basis to making it sticky, right? Making that process disciplined, measured, and optimized. And that requires a lot of organizational understanding and commitment. And so that's that's part of the concern, or the issues we're wrestling with today.
I mean, it's a great point. I mean, it certainly would be anxiety-inducing to not know kind of what the cost is for this. I would argue that you will find efficiency over time, but that initial ramp up is certainly a challenge for organizations. So Greg, just to go back to you for a second before asking a question of Troy. So when you were contemplating using a capability maturity model for USPS, did you encounter these sorts of discussions or this kind of planning where you're going from a checklist driven or a more finite circumscribed set of things to now measuring other aspects of performance that might be new and novel?
I think there's a dimensionalization, if that's a term, that really, Sam's pointing to that moves the discussion of practices from a checklist format to real stickiness. And as I engage clients relative to their journey for CMMC, I'm finding that CMMC and the 800-171 controls are more than just a checklist. They're finding that they're challenged with their organizational scale, and whether an organization has 50 employees or what I had was 600,000 employees, the types of actions that are necessary in order for an organization to make the proper practices against 800-171 controls really vary. And I think an organization needs to be very disciplined in how they scope their approach to addressing each of the control objectives. And that was something that I would constantly revisit with my teams in the Postal Service over the years against which we implemented the RMM model, was what is the appropriate scale against which we're going to implement the list of practices and goals that we were attempting to achieve in our security program, and then build. We would start small and then build out to make sure that more of the organization is covered. With CMMC, I think organizations really need to understand their objectives to protect and needs to protect controlled unclassified information.
That's great. And one of the things we haven't spent a lot of time discussing is how you scope CMMC. And I think there's a vitally important point here, which is this is not ideally applied at the enterprise level, but rather the specific enclaves and containers in which CUI resides. I think this is a key point of confusion for some. So Troy, just a question here. Are you seeing the struggle over scoping with your clients? I mean, I've heard stories of that being one of the key challenges in contemplating CMMC.
Yeah, I was going to add in some of these other answers that are coming in. I think the hardest part of this is figuring out the boundaries of your CMMC system, so to speak, because these are non-federal systems, right? In the federal systems, when you had to be into 171, the whole environment had to be 171, right? But when you're dealing with the suppliers and contractors, identifying where their CUI data is and what type of CUI they're getting and where it resides currently in their environment is a struggle. That's like, that's hard to figure out if the data is not labeled correctly when you get it, if you're not sure who's touching that data, if you're not sure the flow of the CUI once it's in your system. If you don't have any of that documented yet, as I'm sure Sam is probably starting to figure out, that's the number one struggle, and it's very hard to figure out. I don't think I have a good answer, but if I was recommending to anybody starting with this, think about it from an ROI perspective. If the government CUI you're getting is 10% of your business, then you probably want to build an enclave, right? You might want to consider moving to the cloud and using Azure and offloading some of those responsibilities to Azure Gov Cloud, where they have FedRAMP and hopefully there'll be reciprocity and all that fun stuff that we're still waiting on. But if it's a majority of your business, then chances are a majority of your people are touching the data anyways, and then you probably have to scope in a lot more, right? So I think the first aspect is really understanding where's the data, what kind of data are we getting, and how much of it touches do our people need to touch it, and what percentage of our employees are actually using this daily, right? If it's a small percentage, build an enclave. If it's not, you're probably stuck including most of your environment, which could be a struggle.
Yeah, one of the biggest challenges that we've been facing is this idea of globalization, right? So we're a global company in, I think it's 50 different countries, and a lot of our IT support resources are international. And of course, our main processing systems are in global clouds. And so, sometimes we've designed business processes that are intended to be global and universal. So when we have core business functions that require sending this data back and forth, challenging that or bringing that into an enclave is almost anathema to the entire architecture. And so those are definitely issues that we're trying to figure out, right? So where we have, let's say, just key information processing systems that are in an Azure cloud today, and that is the way we get work done. How we can't really justify duplicating that. So how do we wrestle with some of those topics?
So I think it's a really good point that it's a global question now, right? It's not simply within some geographic boundary for many organizations, and yours is, when I think of the challenges for a company like Kennametal or anyone else that has a mixed set of clients, that has to be kind of front of mind.
Right.
With that said, there's something interesting that came up there. I think we'd all agree that going to the cloud doesn't relieve you of your responsibility. It rather allows you to transition some of the execution of those security controls. I think this is another a point of concern for folks, which is understanding how much the third party is doing as opposed to what you're expected to do. This is amplified when there's a very specific attestation component to this, right, in CMMC. So I think we fleshed out some of the basic challenges. I also think about the challenge of just having a workforce that is steeped in this sort of conceptual model, right? So you mentioned, Sam, needing to kind of maybe reskill people to think about these concepts of capability and levels, which is different than we do or do not do on a checklist. So just thoughts about that. Do we see any reskilling or education of the workforce required as a result of CMMC?
I certainly do. I mean, just appreciating the increase in compliance requirements to start, going back to what Greg was saying, right? The idea of managing processes is a reskilling activity. And then in many cases, it's applying these new rules to data in a way we haven't thought of before. So like I said, I really think of this very similar to the GDPR data privacy issue from a few years ago. It's a paradigm shift, and it requires letting people understand that there's a new data type that we need to be more aware of than we were yesterday. And we also have to be very conscious and deliberate of the requirements we place around that. And it introduces entirely new concepts of what is process control and how do you make sure that you're building a reviewable process, something that can be inspected by people like Troy, and make sure that we're doing the right things.
Thanks, Sam. Let's talk about inspecting those processes, inspecting the controls. So doing things at scale is difficult, especially difficult when you're doing it all manually. So it seems to me that in some phase of the CMMC implementation, there'll be a discussion of automation. So I was going to ask Katie, any thoughts about the ability to automate any of the testing or data collection? I know this is all very formative and not intended to put you on the spot, but just curious about your thoughts regarding how we may see automation aid the adoption of CMMC in the future.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the numbers, right, on CMMC and the amount of companies that are going to need to be assessed over the next 5 years, it almost looks like an impossible challenge, right? And so I do think you're going to see some innovative solutions come out. Now, I have absolutely no visibility into, whether there's a plan to do that or not. But, specifically at level 1, right, the organizations that are just holding FCI or federal contract information, and they're, being held to the 15 FAR requirements, it's actually 17 practices in CMMC. I do think that you'll see some innovation pop up around, automation of verification of their. My feeling is that it's very hard to automate process maturity, and that there certainly is value in doing that in an on-site assessment, at levels 2 and 3 or just 3. So I think that then becomes the challenge. But, a lot of the numbers that I've seen is, certainly somewhere north of 50% of div companies would only need a level 1, right? So there are quite a lot of efficiencies to be gained if we can, explore ways for automation at level 1. And then in my opinion, the jury's still out at the higher levels for that.
Thanks, Katie. So a question for Greg and Troy. Both of your organizations are assisting clients with conformance. Troy, you mentioned your organization is pursuing a designation allowed to be one of the bodies that could perform the reviews, and then that would part of accreditation. You mentioned that you are a provisional assessor. So we have this nascent group of folks that are learning the criteria by which we'll measure organizations in their CMMC efforts. Katie mentioned automation. I'm just curious what you're hearing from your clients regarding the kind of join between the need to gather data, existing automation they may possess, and how this might feed into their CMMC compliance efforts.
I guess I can go first. I guess everybody wants it just to be a click of the button. They want the silver bullet. Greg's shaking his head. This is kind of like in any type of compliance work, whether it's this has been going on, since whenever the compliance started. But there's always this battle between automation and then compliance, right? And they don't always work well together. The clients always want to be able to automate it, and then the assessor comes in and has all these additional questions that they really can't answer with the automation, right? So I think there's a balance, and the balance will get there with CMMC. And the closest I can think to automation, I'm just going to go back to the cloud. I'm going to go back to Azure just because I think they're doing a lot of work in this space. And like you said before, cloud is not going to remove your responsibilities, right? But if I can spin up a CMMC environment in Azure Cloud and Gov Cloud and know that the applications they're using have already been assessed to CMMC, hopefully they get their CMMC assessment, and they have configurations. Like I think actually Azure just came out with a compliance assessment piece, right? So you can actually go in and click on, tell me where my CMMC controls are non-compliant in their Azure environment. Now that's only one small piece of this whole puzzle, right? That might get you 50% of the way there, and they're not going to fix it for you. They're just going to identify and say, hey, you should be using this service on this server because you have a gap here, right? Maybe you don't have logging turned on appropriately. That's what that's going to do right now. And I think for now, that's probably the closest we can get to like automation. Is leveraging the cloud as much as we can where it makes sense, but understanding like there's that shared responsibility model. And when the assessor comes in, they're going to want to know that you understand the shared responsibility model. You're going to have to document, okay, for control, this practice here, Azure is doing this, and we are doing this piece of it to configure it correctly, but Azure has this handled. And then again, the question of reciprocity comes in. How does an assessor treat that? I don't know that answer yet because we're still waiting on that, but that's, I think, the closest we're going to get.
Greg,
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to add, if you read Dasty Salazar's recent comments on the CMMC program, I think DoD is signaling sort of what you described, Troy. They're talking about cybersecurity as a service, right? That was one of the recommendations at the end of his testimony. So again, I do think you're going to see some of these ideas pop up, and your cloud one is spot on, right? The shared responsibility model, whereas the implementation may be off your plate. You're still going to have to show, in your documentation and your attestations that, you are managing this and the control requirement is being met. So I think how you explained it was spot on.
Thanks, Katie. Sorry, Greg. Now, but back to you. I'm just curious what you're hearing from your clients regarding the decisions, perhaps to maybe decide that they don't have the requisite skills in-house and that we will procure access to some sort of secured container, right? That's one suggestion I've heard. So over to you, Greg.
Yeah, no, I think those are all approaches in order to be able to meet the objectives of the model. And I'm finding that relative to measurement, most of my clients don't have the level of maturity yet in order to be able to measure at a rate that's repeatable enough to be able to have constant monitoring practices engaged. And quite frankly, the level of measurement that's required is a level 4 CMMC practice, in my opinion, for these organizations. And I don't know that a lot of what my clients are shooting for are going to get them to the level 4 maturity across certain practices in order to be measured at a rate that can be monitored. I do have a client that is very interested in creating a repeatable way to generate evidence that would be consistent with the monitoring objectives. And that's, putting in the appropriate reporting out of Active Directory Azure to be able to show appropriate account management, the appropriate types of things that are necessary in order to have proper monitoring across the their infrastructure from a threats and vulnerabilities perspective. So there are ways and approaches to get monitoring on certain controls, and I think Troy was kind of talking about that relative to what you can do with AWS, but I think some of those areas are going to, some controls are going to be able to be made in repeatable ways that can produce results that are better for and more easily monitored than others.
You mentioned monitoring. I think that's another important element we could unpack here, is that I think there's kind of universal consensus that some continuous evaluation is typically superior to a point in time analysis. So as it stands now, there really isn't a continuous dimension to CMMC, but I think that that's likely something we see evolve. And certainly if other elements of an organizational security program are going that direction, right, you could see this disconnect in the future if there's not also a CDM-like element to CMMC. So thoughts about that. And Sam, I'd maybe ask this question of you, which is, not to give away anything you can't speak to in this sort of forum, but I imagine Kennametal, like all organizations, has a roadmap for technologies in security, and I imagine that automation is on that roadmap at some level. Thoughts about how you may use your automation technology or your continuous monitoring technology to feed compliance efforts, and as a bonus question, any mileage you get collecting data for CMMC that you might use for other efforts like GDPR or CCPA.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly on the table, right? We're have to envision how we're going to do that. Yeah, not to beat the dead horse, but the challenges that we're always facing is when the key resources necessary to execute that automation aren't, for example, in the US, right? And so where the players would be very key for us to do that as a global company, they just can't play because of, the boundary rules. And so that's the challenge we as a company face. So yeah, we definitely can't be competitive, and we can't control costs if we don't automate as much as we can. But then we also have to be very sensitive to who can play and who's able to participate, and what would it cost for us to bring new resources onshore, or to engage an external consultant to help us. How do we balance that?
So you mentioned cost. One of the changes that we see with CMMC is that for the first time, cybersecurity is being described as an allowable cost. Now, of course, that doesn't mean I can just tally up what it costs to CMMC and tack it onto the contract. But a question for the group: are you seeing any change in planning or the way that CMMCs perceive now that there's been a pronouncement that cybersecurity is not an allowable cost in DoD contract?
Well, I think that contributes to the perception that it unfairly benefits the large companies, right? Because they can absorb that cost a lot easier than the small company can, as particularly if they're getting new to this game, right? So they have not only the implementation costs, but then they really can't compete very effectively if they have to pass that cost upwards. And so, yeah, I think that that's a big part of the dilemma overall for the entire adoption of the model and how companies, medium, small size, actually play.
Sam, other thoughts about that from the group?
I've talked to some primes about that particular aspect of things, and they're very interested in trying to figure out approaches to help their key subs be able to come into conformance with the requirements and obviously pass those costs forward into their cost models for DoD. That's the most mature conversations I've had relative to passing costs back into the Defense Department. At the lower levels, with smaller organizations, I think there's this, they don't have that same cost reimbursable type arrangement with DoD, and find that they're going to have to increase the cost of their product in order to be able to encumber the costs of CMMC, which will dilute their ability to perform competitively in the market. And so that's kind of some of the concern that I'm hearing from smaller clients.
No, this is, certainly valid concerns, and I would have those as well if I were in that situation. Greg, you touched on something interesting by the description of sort of prime and sub. So one of the things that CMMC is designed to do is to increase visibility for flow down, right? So understanding the entire causal chain that permits COI to be stolen by an adversary. And that visibility down the supply chain has proven to be very difficult, right? There's things like contract privity that get in the way. But just kind of thoughts about the opportunity here. Maybe, Katie, I'll look to you first regarding the win or the potential win that we see when it comes to kind of broad-based supply chain visibility in CMMC.
Yeah, so the requirement will follow the data, right? So if your sub is going to get CUI from you, they're going to be required to also hold a level 3 or higher. The DoD is still working out the logistics on verification of levels. But from where I sit, this has been a big awakening, right, on how we share data, right? We can no longer just push schematics, all the way down, our 10-tiered supply chain so that the guy just making the bolt receives the entire, F-35 design, right? I'm obviously elaborating a little bit, but right, things like this truly are happening, right? And so putting this requirement in place, I think is going to have a secondary effect to where, these organizations are going to start doing the cost benefit analysis and say, I don't need this data. Don't give me this data. I don't have the environment to support it. And some of that falls also, I think, on the government and, properly marking material and, communicating with the PMO and all of that. So, it's kind of a two-way street, I think, in the data sharing aspect of it. But, I do think you're going to see kind of a cultural shift on, how data is shared down the supply chain.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. I think that at a minimum, as you said, it's making us think hard about what's shared and where it goes. And it's surfacing potential challenges or issues surrounding COI aggregation and also just the variability of understanding as to where this information flows to, right? So I think that it's wholly healthy in that regard. There's sort of a suspension of disbelief when it comes to information classification and use, especially in these sort of situations. So I see that. Again, that's not a criticism of the DIB. This is a challenge shared by all organizations that depend on cyber, which is essentially all organizations. So, I mean, we could have a similar discussion about sensitive data in the banking and finance arena, and we'd come to similar conclusions regarding scale, size, and automation. So Monica's put a note in the chat, and certainly welcome questions or comments from the audience. And barring those, I do have a few more questions on my list.
I was just going to add to the last response too. I think part of the DoD's implementing 7019, 7020 for the SPURS system. I think part of that is to get more visibility into their actual suppliers and forcing everybody to enter their scores in that system. Eventually that will be like the database of suppliers, supposedly, right? And I think it's very slow moving right now in adoption right now, right? Because it can't really retroactively require it, I don't think. But I think eventually that's going to help with the visibility into where all the data is going.
Thanks, Troy. It's a really good point. There's a question from the audience regarding CMMC and its relevance or applicability to the non-DIB context. So there's been some suggestion, I've seen this from a few corners now, that CMMC could be applied to, for instance, federal civilian agencies. Now, Greg, I know USPS is not a federal civilian agency, kind of in this interesting space, but just your thoughts. If you were back at USPS, again, not speaking for USPS, how would you be contemplating that suggestion that perhaps CMMC is something we should consider and comply with as an agency?
I think that if projecting back to my seat in government, there's a strong responsibility that we have as government officials in order to be able to protect the data that is defined as controlled unclassified information. And I think the level of controls that are being suggested are probably commensurate with the protection needs of some of those categories of information. I think the government supply chain has not done our due diligence over time on how to properly protect very sensitive information that the government should do a better job of protecting. I think that I hate to compliment the credit card industry, but PCI is much better from a control set perspective because there's a set of control requirements on it than what DoD has done or the government agencies have done to assure proper protection of CUI. CUI is much more difficult to find, tag, identify and protect, but if I was projecting back in my seat, I think it's something that should be considered. And, I don't know that it is being considered. I had the unique opportunity yesterday to talk to an executive in Department of Homeland Security about this particular part of the executive order. And, they're looking for approaches. I think that they're not going to be quick to adopt CMMC as the default approach, but I do expect that there will be some framework that develops that provides better controls over CUI as a result of what's called out in the executive order.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. I think at a minimum, some reasonable reciprocity will emerge, right? So if you're doing assessments of other types for Homeland Security or Department of Energy or what have you, you'd think there'd be, or FFIEC, there'd be some interplay there that allows you to then create an equivalence. Katie, a question for you. Sort of at the big picture level, what are the next major milestones in the CMMC project?
So there's quite a bit of guidance that is still outstanding that needs to be released. This includes scoping guidance. So Appendix A of the assessment guides will be released. There will be a documentation release that actually we went through, and it's no change to the model, but we wrote some additional examples specifically around the process maturity objectives. So we wrote some stories, some real world, how to implement process maturity. The biggest activity going on right now is addressing the public comments for rulemaking. The last timeline that I have seen is that, they're end of the summer, beginning of fall, the rule would be final with the public comments adjudicated. So I think you'll see that. Looking down the road, I anticipate a significant update to levels 4 and 5, just based on the release of the 172 alpha publication that was most recently, I believe it's out for public comment right now through NIST. So that's certainly going to impact the model because 171 and 172 are foundational to CMMC, but if you're familiar with 172, it's a controls catalog. It's a selection of controls by the 171 set of controls. So I think you'll see that, it's in the public domain that, there's some internal reviews going on, a GAO review going on. So you may see some changes to implementation, right? That wouldn't surprise me. I don't have insight into what those might be. But I encourage everybody to, look at the ANS website for, the authoritative source for CMMC and model updates and stuff like that.
Thanks, Katie. So I'm thinking about the panel. We have quite the composite of CMMC roles, right? So Katie working as a model architect, Sam as a member of the DIB, Greg and Troy assisting clients that have to take on board CMMC and make it part of the way they work. So I think this is a sort of mirrors the people I'd want in the room to kind of contemplate CMMC as and talk about its value. So as a thought for the group, the supply chain risk management challenge for the DoD is not going away. So I think an expectation we all have to have in mind is that CMMC, like all models, like all regulation, will evolve over time. And that's going to be driven not only by some of the limitations that we discussed or high spots that emerged in conversation, like scalability, the availability of assessors based on needing to reskill the workforce, but also the nature of the threat. So I think that we're likely to see the model change as the threat landscape changes. So I'm wondering, I know this is maybe a drifting far afield here, but just thoughts about that, how you've seen this sort of effort in the past, these sorts of efforts, mold and transform based on these factors like the evolving threat landscape or changing technology.
So I don't know, Matt, if that's for the group, but I will say I'll say that that's certainly, if you look at the 20 Delta controls that are in level 3 right now, many of those are geared toward the most common threats to the DIB small businesses. So phishing, ransomware, the addition of the availability practices, so I absolutely think that there's an appetite to continue to update the model, certainly not every 6 months, right? But as the threat landscape evolves. I will also say with the addition of the situational awareness domain and some of the risk assessment practices that were added as part of the 20 deltas, those were added in to help organizations become more proactive in their activities, right? So the threat intel is added in situational awareness. And that's not a 171 practice, but we thought it was important for organizations to start becoming more aware of current threats and then addressing them through their risk management process. So some of that is baked into the model, But I certainly think you will, DoD is committed to, keeping the model current as the threat landscape evolves.
Yeah,
I mean,
I'm sorry, please.
I was gonna, I mean, if you think of any compliance framework, I mean, PCI is on version 4.1 is coming out, right? And if you think about when PCI started, it started because of the Target breach. That was the TJ Maxx Target that put it on the map, right? Was ransomware even a word when the Target breach happened? Probably not, right? So the threat landscape, as you're mentioning, is always changing. And I think, like you said, situational awareness, maybe recovery was added as a domain. I can't remember exactly, but obviously recovering from ransomware is a big deal now, right? And how do you handle that? And that backups help all of a sudden become very important. And are they, off the network, and can you recover quickly? That has become a huge risk now. That probably was it was a risk, but ransomware, that made it a huge risk, I feel like, all of a sudden. So that's just an example of how, it is ever changing, and the original framework might not have considered it, when you look at like PCI 15 years ago or something.
And then just to build on what Katie and Troy have just said, CMMC is a security strategy to meet business goals. And it's being implemented by DoD to meet their business goals to protect CUI. It needs to be considered by every business in order to be able to align with their business strategies to contract with the government. And I think to the extent that risk reduction is a business goal for every organization, I think we need to get more aggressive, to Troy's point about ransomware and the other types of risks that organizations are facing, in the controls that really address those particular activities. And to the extent that a model like CMMC can support risk reduction for organizations, I think we need to do more of this and refine it over time.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, and I think that something we don't say enough in cybersecurity, and sometimes seems heretical, is that everything we do in cyber is subordinate to some risk decision, right? And this is another example of that we're trying to get risk to a tolerable level. And as you said, it's aligned to business objectives. So we're closing in on the end of the session. I want to thank everyone for the participation today. So Greg, Troy, Sam, and Katie, thanks so much for your insights this morning. Really appreciate them, and good luck in your respective CMC journeys.
So thank you. That was great. Matthew, thanks for moderating that. Thanks to each and every one of you for joining us today. It's been a great morning.